Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today to join our journalist webinar, What to Expect from Indonesia's 2019 Fire Season. First, we'd like to make sure that everyone can hear us okay. So if you can hear us, please click the raise your hand function in the Zoom platform. Great, thank you. Okay, so thanks again for joining. This is a journalist webinar on what to expect from Indonesia's 2019 fire season. I'm Katie Fletcher, Communications Lead at the World Resource Institute for our Global Forest Watch initiative. We're excited to have WRI experts join us today from both our DC and Indonesia office to forecast Indonesia's upcoming 2019 fire season. So during this webinar, we'll set the scene by talking a little bit about Indonesia's fire history and what's caused these outbreaks to be so intense in the past. Then our experts will dive into some of the weather and policy conditions that indicate what we could expect for the fire season in Indonesia this year. Finally, we'll give a demo of the Global Forest Watch Fires platform, which can hopefully support your future reporting. I want to note that we'll spend the first 30 minutes of this webinar on dialogue from our team, and we'll then aim to dedicate a full 30 minutes to answering questions from you. So if you have questions, please put them into our Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. If you're having any technical issues, please type that into the chat and we'll do our best to help as soon as possible. I also want to note that we're recording this webinar today and we'll email that around to everyone who joined. Okay, so joining us today, I'd like to introduce Hidayah Hamza, a research analyst based in our WRI Indonesia office. Hidayah supports spatial analysis for a number of our forest and land use tools related to GFW's commodity work. Hidayah also supports WRI's work with Indonesia's peatland restoration agency. We also have Andika Putraditama here, the Sustainable Commodities and Business Manager, also located in WRI Indonesia's office. Andika works closely with WRI's Global Commodities team and manages WRI Indonesia's effort to drive sustainable agricultural commodity supply chains. I'll also note that Andika was among the WRI team tracking and analyzing fire outbreaks back in 2013 prior to the launch of our GFW Fires platform. And finally, we have Ty Monroe, a research analyst for Global Forest Watch initiative. She joins us from the WRI DC office. Ty works on GIS for both our Fires platform and commodities-related work with GFW Pro. Ty holds a degree in atmospheric science and a master's in earth systems science. Great, so I'll pass it over to Ty to get started.
Hi, everybody. We have convened this webinar today to talk about how you, as journalists and reporters, can use the GFW Fires platform to supplement your stories and extract key insights about fire trends. So we'll be focusing our examples on Indonesia and the Indonesian fire season. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, since the 1990s, Indonesian fires have been making international headlines. What started out as an occasional anomaly soon turned into an annual event, having major direct and indirect implications for ecology, livelihoods, health, climate, and economy. The growth of the Indonesian agricultural sector has led to an increase in the methodological burning of vegetated land to clear for oil palm, rubber, and other plantations. These fires can get out of control when conditions have been dry for prolonged periods, for instance, during a strong El Nino event. And the presence of combustible methane gas stored in the vast peatlands also causes fires to burn for long periods of time. The smoke from these fires has many times created hazardous air quality conditions for those in neighboring countries and has also sparked the creation of international agreements trying to manage the burning and enforce legal action. For the most part, these fires are illegal, except for those set by smallholder farmers with less than 2 hectares of land. So the effects that these fires have on Southeast Asia impact not only health and the environment, but also cause a loss of habitat for wildlife and increase Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions. The GFW Fires platform, which I will demo later during this training, was launched in July 2014 to address the problem of chronic land fires in Indonesia, and not a year too soon. 2015 was the worst year for fires in Indonesia since 1997-98, causing unprecedented haze and air quality issues, and producing more fire alerts than the 2 previous years and any of the years since, as shown in this graph here. There are around 4,000 fire alerts at any given time in 2015. Nearly 500,000 people had to seek medical attention for fire and air quality related injuries, and there have been at least 24 confirmed deaths. It was our thinking that combining near real-time wind and air quality data with fire detection data could help raise awareness of fires as they occur and help mobilize emergency response action early on and track trends over time in order to help prevent crises like this. Part of the reason 2015 was so bad is the fact that it was an especially strong El Nino year. A simplified explanation for the El Nino cycle, which occurs roughly every 2 to 7 years, is that during a strong El Nino event, the wind direction across the Pacific Ocean, as well as the pressure patterns, switch and cause a general high pressure system to build over Southeast Asia and Australia. These cause warmer and drier conditions. Currently, we're in a weak El Nino phase, which is likely to continue into the summer. This means in general, we will see warmer and drier weather than usual in Indonesia, which has a strong potential for causing more fires and more prolonged burning, but it will likely not be as intense as conditions in the peak fire years like 2015 or 1997. So in some parts of the world, like the Southwest United States, El Nino brings some much needed rain. However, in Southeast Asia, El Nino causes prolonged drought and warmer weather than usual, which dries out the vegetation and increases the flammability risk and impact that a fire would have if it were to spark. So the lack of rain and increase in temperatures, like I just mentioned, cause the vegetation to dry out, which makes ideal fuel for forest fires. The dry leaves and forest canopies can catch fire quickly and expand among tree crowns if the wind conditions are right. The drier ground vegetation also poses a major threat, providing the spark that could ignite peat layers within the soil. The GFW Fires platform actually allows users to explore many factors that could influence the growth or overall impact a fire can have, including fire weather risk data. So on the GFW Fires platform, I'll show later that you can examine fire weather risk, which tells you about the flammability risk of the ground cover. And so you can see here that this graph overlays fire weather risk data with fire counts for 2015, and a majority of the fire alerts actually occurred during a period of sustained high flammability. So you could use this information to help track where fires might occur, and if they do occur, if the event will be extremely damaging. And also just to mention kind of the difference between an El Nino year versus a non-El Nino year. The fire count in blue is showing the fires during 2015, while the fire count in orange is showing 2016. So you can see that there is a tremendously more fire alerts picked up during 2015 than in 2016 because of these drier and warmer conditions. And so now I'll hand it off to Hidayah to talk about peatlands.
Thank you, Tai. So in the next few slides, I will present on issues on peatland fires in Indonesia. Indonesia has the largest tropical peatlands, around 14 million hectares, according to the Ministry of Agriculture. And we host around 36 of total peatlands globally. So the peatlands itself has formed thousands of years from decaying organic material from soil and plant decay. The peatlands in Indonesia stores 20 times carbon more than the mineral soil, and this is due to both in above ground from the trees and the forests, and largely from below ground soil that contains the peat. Moreover, this ecosystem has unique biodiversity where the trees that has adapted to grow in wetlands, and also flagship species and animals like tigers, orangutans, and elephants. However, for so many years, the peat are largely being drained to be converted to plantation and agriculture. These peatlands are drained by building large canals across these wetlands, and therefore making it dry. After the peatlands are being drained and dry, opening up these areas for plantations often use fires, and that's what causes the haze and smoke, especially in 2015 fire episode. And both the pit draining and the fires cause immense global cause greenhouse gas emissions, which is the cause of international concerns. Next slide, please. So this is the emission, the graph for the emissions from 2015 fires So it shows that the Indonesia fire episodes that only lasted for several months in 2015 generates emission each day exceeding the average daily emissions from all US economic activity, while the US economy is 20 times higher than Indonesia. So as Ty said that 2.6 million hectares of area was burned in 2015, and this largely happens in peatlands. And this has exacerbated Indonesia's emission. And this is important because the Indonesian government has committed to reduce 29% of emission below business as usual by 2030 and up to 41% with international assistance and cooperation. And if this peat fires and also smoke and haze does not tackle immediately, then the government will have challenges in achieving their NDC target. This also creates the momentum for the government to accelerate the effort by forming the peat restoration agency and other peatlands associated efforts. Next slide, please. So there are several peatland protection and restoration efforts that has been conducted by either the government and also the public, also the private sectors in Indonesia. The first one is the Moratorium of Forest and Peat that was started in 2011 and still applies now. The regulation stipulates that there is no new opening for plantation on these moratorium areas. Other than that, in 2014, the government also issued regulations that there are certain way for the water table in plantation need to be at certain level to maintain water table in peatlands. And this is to better manage hydrological aspect of peatlands and also to prevent fires from happening. Since the water table is, if it can be maintained, it can keep the peat soil wet. The Ministry of Environment and Forestry also issued regulation that determine areas where the function has conservation, where areas to be conserved, and also to utilize for plantation, for example. And this was issued in 2016. At the same year, the president also formed Peat Restoration Agency, or called BRG, to coordinate restoration efforts in degraded peatlands due to fires and canals in 7 provinces. Next slide, please. This is a brief overview of what the BRG does. So there are total of, from BRG data, there are a total of 12.9 million hectares that they map is degraded. 6.7 million hectares needs to be protected, whereby this area still has forested on peat, and around 6 million or 47%, around 6.7 million hectares are still degraded, and 6.1 million are still forested and intact. So out of the 6.7 million, BRG prioritizes 2 million hectares, or around 37%, to be restored by 2020, while the rest of the areas could be restored by companies, SOs, local government, and other stakeholders. So to achieve this target, BRG has three-pronged restoration strategy called 3R. So rewetting of peatlands through canal blocking, revegetation of degraded peat, and also revitalization of communities' livelihood surrounding the peatlands. And I'm handing it over to Andika.
Thank you, Idai. Hi all, Andika is speaking now. So now I'm going to talk briefly about key policy changes and progress that has been made by both the government and companies regarding their responses to forest fires. But first, I'm going to revisit what we're facing the first time we track in real time the forest fire situation in Indonesia. So we started monitoring the hotspots and overlaying that information with relevant information such as commercial agriculture and forestry licenses back in 2013. But at a time, there was virtually no easy way to track where the hotspots were, and very little information on landowners. our publications on the list of companies that had hotspots were met with a bit of a hostility by most companies, as well as government. But if we fast forward to 2019, I think we can say that we have seen significant progress from both the industry and the government. It's fair to say that the transparency of spatial information is now becoming the norm. Major producers, traders, and buyers of commodities, they're all demanding their supply chain to open up data. In fact, companies have shared thousands of data voluntarily, including to platforms such as Global Forest Watch. Government have started to open up their database as well, albeit very slowly, and they haven't shared the data in a format that enables us to do advanced spatial analysis on it. So they would share a PDF, they would share a JPEG file, but they wouldn't share the shape file. But in short, we've seen changes of attitude from key stakeholders when it comes to spatial information related to forest fires, and I think this is a crucial step to address the issue. Now, the first key policy piece that I want to talk about is One Map. As you might already aware, this ambitious policy is aimed to align spatial information in Indonesia. There are three main stages in One Map policy. The first one is what they call as compilation stage, which is basically collecting all 85 thematic maps from 19 ministry and agency for all 34 provinces in Indonesia. The second step is integration of these 85 thematic maps with base topographic map at a scale of 1 to 50K to ensure that they align with major topographic features. And the last step is what they call as synchronization process. Now, the government has completed the first step of compilation and the second stage of integration in 2018, and they are now in the process of synchronizing these thematic maps. And this is actually the most challenging part. This step is crucial to resolve overlapping land claims and would include multiple government panels to resolve these conflicts. But this ongoing process will help inform local government and companies to clarify their boundaries, and in the process making it easier for concerned parties to monitor and enforce land use regulations, particularly for occurrences of forest fires. The second key policy that I want to highlight is the palm oil moratorium that is signed by President Joko Widodo back in 2018. The policy effectively halt the issuance of new palm oil licenses, but the other key piece of this policy that is underreported, I think, is the mandatory requirement for all provincial and district government to review existing licenses of palm oil. So if this is done right, this can potentially reduce the practices of land banking, land speculation that is one of the root of the forest fire situation in Indonesia. The policy also highlights the importance of aligning existing licenses with One Map policy, as well as a call for yield intensification measures rather than just extensification. So hopefully with this policy, we will see less expansion, less opening of new plantation, and less fires on the landscape eventually. Another key piece of the whole forest fire situation in Indonesia is companies' commitment to sustainability principles. For the last 5 years, we've seen proliferation of sustainability commitments from various levels of companies. Growers, traders, and buyers of key commodities are now having this internal policy in place that requires them to better manage lands that they are sourcing from. This is, of course, a very ambitious task, especially if we're talking about traders who have maybe thousands of meal within their portfolio, and they might not necessarily have leverage over their suppliers. But the effort to clean up the supply chain of key commodities is well underway. And this will exert pressure to growers on the ground to be more aware of environmental aspect of their operation, which at the end of the day will greatly help with the fire situation. But the proliferations of sustainability commitment is not without its gap. Even with more companies declaring their commitments, we still have significant gaps in terms of certified versus non-certified products. In the palm oil sector, for example, only around 20% of the globally traded crude palm oil is certified. This calls the importance of a demand-side intervention rather than just a supply-side intervention. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that sustainability journey should also work for major emerging markets such as Indonesia, India, and China, and not just for European and United States markets. So this is also the thing that we're working on right now. The last slide I have, on the previous slides, I have mentioned that we have witnessed changes of behavior from some of the key players involved. But let's not forget that economy also plays a very crucial role when we're talking about commodities. So when we looked at the numbers, the price of crude palm oil is actually on a downward trend for the last 8 years. And this trend definitely affects the industry's appetite to expand their operation. And so the real test of changes in how the government and industry manages the land is not here yet. The real test is when the price of key commodities such as oil palm bounces back and on an upward trend, and when we have strong El Nino occurrences, that is the perfect timing to see whether the government and industry effort to better manage their land is actually have significant impact on how they manage the land. So I'll stop there and I'll let my colleague Tai to continue with GFW Fires demo, and then we can have discussions on the policy afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Andika. So now I'm going to take you guys over to the Global Forest Watch Fires platform. So what it is an online platform for monitoring and responding to these land fires in near real time. And basically you can access a whole bunch of different data sets on not only fires, but also things like weather data, days since last rainfall, as well as contextual land use layers like plantations, different concessions, protected areas. And then through all this, you can actually search through high resolution satellite imagery to see what's going on the ground. And you can also create custom charts and graphics using the fire report functionality. So I'm going to take you guys over there now and briefly dig into some of these data sets. Okay, so what we're looking at now is, I already had this preloaded, but if you had typed in fires.globalforestwatch.org, it would take you to their main page. So the main page is this page here, and you can go to there's a link to the map here, but briefly, I wanted to point out to you that if you scroll down, there's a few other resources for potential use for journalists and reporters. The GFW main flagship platform, there's a link down here where you can go and explore some tree cover and tree cover loss related data. In the blog, you can actually find other stories that have been previously reported on Indonesia fires as well as global fires. And then there's also a how-to portal that actually gives a lot of different demonstrations on how to use these platforms even more. So from here, if you click on the view map page, it'll take you to the Global Forest Watch Fires platform. And the first thing that you'll see when you come onto this page are all of these points. And these are actually all of the fire alerts that have been picked up within the past 24 hours. So on the Fires platform, we actually display two different satellite sensors data. One is VIIRS and one is MODIS. MODIS actually has a revisit time of twice a day and a resolution of 1 kilometer. And so you could actually get a fire alert up to twice a day for really near real-time information. And then VIIRS has a slightly higher resolution, which is 375 meters as well. So here, that's the global data set. For global fires, you can search the archive for up to 1 year. So you can see here that it says past 24 hours. But you can search up to 1 week quickly, and then you can also put in a custom range for these two data sets up to 1 year ago. But for Indonesia specifically, because Indonesia has such intense fire seasons and there are so many policy implications that also deal with these fires, we have an archive data set that actually goes back to the beginning of the time that so the 2013 fire season, when these fires really started to have big impacts and implications. So if you click on the archive fires for Indonesia, most of my examples, I will just be looking at from the beginning of 2019 up until today. So you can see that already in 2019, we've had a lot of fires in Indonesia. And so for some context information on some of these fires, we can turn on some of the other layers. So first, we'll look at some of the weather data. So you can turn on this layer, which is wind direction. It actually shows you in near real time the wind direction and speed of, it's a global layer, but you can also change the date. So maybe say we wanted to look a week ago instead of today, what the wind direction was like, if we were looking at fires specifically from a week ago. We can also turn on fire weather, which, like I mentioned in the previous slides, it tells you about the flammability risk of certain areas. So you can see the peninsular Malaysia as well as Riau have very high fire weather risk, which means that if fires were to occur there, as we actually saw, that it will probably cause intense burning of the vegetation there. And lastly, a weather data set that we have is days since the last rainfall. So you can see that some of these areas where a lot of these fires have been occurring actually haven't had rain in almost 20 days. So those are some of the weather data sets. And then now we'll kind of dig into maybe something to keep an eye on too. Here in Riau, like I had shown before, there seems to be a cluster of fires here that are occurring more than in other parts of Indonesia right now. And say we wanted to see some other context information about what these fires, what the implications of these fires are. So we can turn on a forest moratorium data set, like Andika was mentioning before, or Hidayah was mentioning before in her slide, that forest moratorium is where you aren't supposed to be clearing for new plantations, but you can see that on these forest moratorium polygons, there's actually a lot of fires within them. And so we can also look on other data sets and see if it's occurring in protected areas. So some of them are occurring on protected areas, which is not good because that's destroying habitat that's supposed to be protected. And lastly, you can see that there are a lot of fires that are actually occurring on peatlands, which for reasons we mentioned before, have higher carbon emissions and cause really bad smog and haze. So these fires particularly have occurred in really tight clusters since the beginning of 2019. So this might be an area, because there's been little rain and it's occurring on a forest moratorium area and in peat, it might be something to keep an eye on. One thing I wanted to show you guys was that if you wanted to kind of see the data without without all the other, without all these legends and everything, you can press this eye down here and hide some of that extra information. And then another thing that we can actually do is share the link. If you wanted to share the link with someone that you work with, you can actually share the link and it'll send them all the data that is currently pulled up in your web browser right now, and then take them exactly to what you're looking at. We can also change the imagery underneath our map. So you saw earlier that it switched from the map we were currently seeing to this darker gray map, but we can also add high resolution imagery to look at the land cover underneath. So if I wanted to look at February 2019 to see what's actually underneath these fire clusters, I can turn off the fires layer and turn off the peat layer and zoom in to see what these fires are actually occurring on. So you can see the burn scars here. It looks like these fires are occurring near some agricultural lands. So that is all information that you can gather from the platform just by turning on and off different data layers and looking at the imagery. Another example of something that we might want to keep an eye on is there's an expansion of a coal mining site that I had noticed before. So if we turn back on our fires data, what I just did now is I turned on the coal mining concession layer. So you can see that all of these polygons here were actually their concessions for coal mining areas. But over time, we've actually seen the expansion of one over in Borneo. here. So what I have turned on are my primary forest layers, as well as these coal mining concession boundaries like I showed you before. And so you can see that there has been one fire in the past 24 hours here, but since the start of 2019, there have been a handful of fires within these coal mining concessions. And so you can actually zoom in pretty closely in this high resolution imagery and see what is actually the expansion of this data. And we can actually look back into previous time periods to watch that expansion happen in near real time. If you'll see in the middle here, all those roads that were here actually disappear. And then so we can jump forward and see that expansion happen in near real time. And if you explore this site on the Global Forest Watch main platform, you can see that there's been a lot of tree cover loss in this area due to this, due to the expansion of this coal mine. And so one last thing I'll show you guys on this part of the platform is that you can actually subscribe to alerts. So if you actually wanted to track the alerts that are happening on this coal mining site, you can draw an area around the site that you want, click on it, and you can put in your email information or your phone number and receive alerts every time there's actually a fire in an area that you're interested in. Okay, and so lastly, I'll take you guys to the fire report. So here you can actually create fire reports for any country in the world and their sub-regions and select a date that you actually want to see the fires for. I have one preloaded up for Indonesia. Sorry, I had all of these preloaded just in case our connection was a little slow. But I have this fire report loaded for Indonesia, and this is just from the beginning of 2019. So you can see that there have already been almost 20,000 fire alerts in 2019. So the first things you'll see is a distribution of the fire alerts that actually show you where all of these alerts have occurred, which satellite they're from. And then if you scroll down further, it'll show you that the number of alerts by province. So you can see Riau, like I was showing before, already is the highest, has the highest number of alerts in Indonesia for 2019. So that area is probably, will probably keep showing up throughout the year. And then also it'll show you alerts by district, which are the districts in Indonesia were too small to show on this map. But another thing that this report shows, which is really helpful, are all the fire alerts since 2001. So you can see this was part of the graph that I showed earlier, where the fire alerts in 2015, where there were many alerts there, as well as 2013. And then if you keep scrolling down, you can see that we have some other statistics. And just for the data that we have, so for all of the concessions data that Global Forest Watch has, but not necessarily all the concessions data that exist, we have fire alerts within those areas and what percentage of those occurred in things like plantations or protected areas or peatland. So you can see in 2019, half of the fire alerts have already occurred on peatland. So that is the fires report. And then down at the bottom, there's another graphic that shows you how this year is stacking up to previous years in terms of fire alerts up to this day and time. You can also go and look at specific subregions fire alerts, so Aceh or Riau. So you can see that we're kind of the median right now, but on track to keep increasing.
Great, yeah. Thanks, Ty, Andika, and Hidayah. We'd like to spend the rest of the time answering questions from you all. As I mentioned before, to ask a question, please input them into the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. We'll pause for just a moment and give you time to type your questions. Great. Thanks, everyone, for typing in your questions, and you can continue to type these as they come up. So the first question that we have is, what do you think about BRG and MOEF's performance for preventative forest fires? We know there are many provinces where forest fires are occurring again. What about predictions of forest fires in 2019, and what must the government do for preventative forest fires in Indonesia this year? Hidayah, do you want to answer that?
Sure, Katie. So thanks, Lucia, for the questions. For the efforts on restorations, especially for preventing forest fires, I think BRG and MOEF has done various efforts. For example, BRG has conducted canal blocking to re-wet the peatlands again, so that it prevent fires. It prevent the peatlands becomes dry and vulnerable to fires. And many of these efforts has been conducted in the last 2 years or 3 years by BRG. For example, just earlier this year, BRG stated that they have restored around, they have re-wetted around 679 hectares of the restoration target area by BRG. And also the Ministry of Environment and Forestry also have coordinated many concession companies to review their concession plans, planting plans annually, and also submit data on groundwater level for each area of the concession that the MOEF is monitored. And sorry, and the MOEF also stated that up to 2018, the peatland areas that has been re-wetted is by the MOEF is almost 3.1 million hectares, and that is large areas. However, there are lacking of transparency from either the BRG and the MOEF of where are the areas that has been restored and re-wetted, and there needs to be more transparency of this data set, so that also the public can also monitor what they are doing, what the governments are doing, and also the companies are doing. And another question is, what about prediction of forest fire in 2019? So actually, earlier this year, we've seen many fires happening, especially in Riau, due to a bit of a drier climate. But many of the experts, the weather experts, have been warning that this year, June to September probably, there will be a drier season mostly, and there needs to be a coordination with the government, disaster agency, MOEF, also BRG, and also the local government to mitigate the fires, prevent the fires from happening on where are areas that potentially is can the hotspot or the forest fires is happening.
Quick addition to Hidayah's answer. I think it should be also noted that the coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs is also leading an effort to shift the focus of fire regarding the forest fire situation from suppressions of forest fires into prevention of forest fires. So they're now, I heard that they are now piloting a project in Riau province to have a prevention of forest fire approach with a clustered approach. So they're working together with coalitions of companies as well as smallholders and communities to make sure that every inch of Riau's land is being monitored and can be enforced if there's fires. But of course, the effectiveness of this approach and policy is not yet to be seen. So we'll see in the next couple of weeks what will happen in Indonesia forest fire situation.
Yeah, and if I could also just add one quick thing onto that, I think it's a very circular process. So the El Nino predictions, that the fact that we're in a weak El Nino for this year does mean that the land is drier and the conditions are more right for fires to spread if a fire starts, but it really starts with prevention of the fires first. So if there isn't anything to ignite the fire, then the land isn't going to burn. So I think that these two things kind of go hand in hand. So this year, I think will be interesting to see whether these policies are implemented well in order to prevent this weak El Nino year from really being a devastating fire season.
Great, thank you all, that's helpful. So the next question is to ask to tell us a little bit more about what we can expect the elections to impact fires this year in Indonesia.
Right. Okay. So if any of you watched the debate on environmental topics for this presidential election, there's hardly any real conversations about the need to protect the forest. What is actually happening back then was conversations about how Indonesia could improve the productions of oil palm. So there's this whole national sentiment to support the palm oil industry and make sure that Indonesia is shifting into more of a biofuel economy and then replacing the fossil fuel with biofuel coming from CPO. So I think this is not a good narrative from the government, from the upcoming government, whoever wins the election. Both of them agree that biofuel is the solution for climate change, which is not necessarily correct. If the biofuel is coming from forested area, if the palm oil is coming from forested area and then turn into biofuel, that would not necessarily reduce our carbon emission, because it will only displace the emission from fossil fuel into a land use based emission. So there's hardly impact from the election. There's no political commitment, I think, to push these protections on forest forward. This is kind of different with 5 years before when Jokowi took the presidency. At that time, we had a massive forest fire in 2013 as well as in 2015, and that's one of the reasons why Jokowi developed this plan to reduce forest fires with the establishment of the Peatland Restoration Agency. And for the past 2 to 3 years, we haven't seen any major outbreak of fire. So I think the public demand and a public memory of all this forest fire situation is kind of diminishing, and it's no longer seen as an urgent issue to be addressed in this political cycle, which is unfortunate.
Thanks, Andika. So moving on to the next question, are hotspots necessarily fires? Tom, I'll hand this over to you.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that by hotspots, you mean fire alerts. So all these points that you actually see when the map is uploaded. So basically when a satellite passes over an area, it's measuring the heat produced by the ground there and the intensity of that heat. So this means that it could be either a really large area that is producing a low amount of heat, a really small area that is burning really intensely and producing heat. However, there are sometimes false positives in these satellite overpasses, and these false positives could be from strong reflection off of surfaces that are metal or water, or off the top of clouds. However, there has been a lot of improvement in NASA's algorithms that actually remove a lot of these false positives. So I think that the accuracy rate of these alerts actually being fires is around like 80 to 90%. One thing that I do want to mention, though, is that these fires don't distinguish between the satellite can't distinguish between the cause of fires. So whether or not these fires are burning because of volcanic activity or because of slash and burn, or whether they were caused by lightning, the satellite can't distinguish between those types of fires. And also, if a satellite passes over an area that's been burning for more than one day, it'll pick that up again as a second point. So it can't distinguish between fires that have been burning for long periods of time versus only a short period of time. And also can't distinguish between what caused the fire. And one last thing is, because the resolution of these satellites is somewhat large, so around 1 kilometer for MODIS and 375 for VIIRS, there might be more than one fire burning within that point itself. So there's kind of a few things to take into account there, but in general, the accuracy of these satellite instruments is better than any that we've seen previously.
Great. Thanks, Sai. So we have another question about policy implications. We've seen a global call to reduce demand for palm oil, like in the EU. What are the alternatives for smallholder farmers who depend on agroforestry initiatives to make a living?
Sure, that's a very interesting question and very timely. The situation with EU wants to phasing out biofuel from palm oil is quite interesting to follow. As of now, the market that provides a premium price for certified palm oil is very handful of markets. Only a European Union, United States market, and a couple of other markets. But the majority of palm oil markets for Indonesia is actually the domestic market, and then China, India, and Pakistan, who doesn't give any premium price. So by phasing out biofuel from palm oil, EU is actually diminishing the incentive for a producer that has already been investing a lot on the safeguard to produce palm oil sustainably into market that are not having this safeguard. So domestic market of Indonesia and in China and India and Pakistan doesn't have any sustainability safeguard in place. So this is a problematic situation which calls for a shift into the strategy for more of a demand side intervention. We need to ensure that the market, the emerging market, major emerging markets such as China and Indonesia can increase the uptake of certified sustainable palm oil in the future and provide a market signal to incentivize a producer that wants to do the right thing to produce sustainable certified palm oil. As for the effect for the smallholder farmers, it is still possible to produce a certified sustainable palm oil based on smallholders. There has been a lot of efforts in Indonesia in some of the provinces that we work with, in Riau and in South Sumatra, to educate farmers on what it means to produce palm oil sustainably. But the biggest challenge of having them certified is actually on the legal part of it. A lot of these farmers doesn't have land titling that would prevent them from having certified for a voluntary scheme such as RSPO. So this is still a problem that needs to be resolved with the government regulation. But there's a lot of efforts ongoing on the ground to make sure that smallholders understand that they can also produce certified sustainable palm oil. Agroforestry is also a solution, and this could also work within a forest estate. So palm oil cannot be planted within a forest estate, but agroforestry system can be within the forest estate. The expansion of government program of social forestry is one solution for this. The government wants to ramp up the number of social forestry area from a mere, I believe, 1.4 million hectares up to 12.7 million hectares in 2020, if I'm mistaken. So this is going to be a major shift in the land use policy in Indonesia, and it would enable farmers who wants to switch the crops from palm oil to a more agroforestry-based crops such as rubber and other agroforestry crops, that they can still earn a good livelihood without having to choose between illegal palm oil or forest fire situation.
Thanks, Andika. So we're moving to the next question. Someone would like to know more on thinking around this year's El Nino. Assuming that El Nino continues, when do you expect to see significant peatland burning? Hidayah, I wonder if that's a question you'd like to take?
Sure. So for these fires, I think that as Ty already mentioned, that this year's El Nino is a weaker El Nino, but that doesn't mean that the fire is not happening. So one of the news that article that was posted in earlier this year stated that we should expect more drier climate in August to September, October, and therefore needs to be watchful more to fires or hotspots occurring in areas that have drier climate weather. So yeah, I think as we can see in this earlier this year that we have seen hotspots occurring in Riau and also West Kalimantan. So I think if it gets drier by mid of this year, we also need to be more careful on these areas.
Thanks, Hidayah. So we'll move to the next question. Indonesia's planning minister said on Tuesday that the country would be joining a low-carbon development pathway. The plan, which was co-developed by WRI, commits the country to embrace more sustainable management of forests, but it's been on concrete policy proposals from what I understand. Do you have any info on what the government's endorsement of the low-carbon development initiative might mean for forest fires? Andika, I'll hand that to you first.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The LCDI launch this week, the Low Carbon Development for Indonesia. This is a high-level document, high-level development document of the Indonesian government. Ideally, political rhetorics should be aligned with policy languages. So when I talked about the presidential debate earlier, that doesn't send a good signal for protections of forests. This is one of those occurrences that when political rhetorics is not aligned with policy languages. In fact, within our bureaucracy, there's a lot of effort ongoing to align sectoral initiative to be more in line with what we are aspiring to achieve in terms of low carbon development. In terms of the policy, a specific policy itself, LCDI tries to reduce GHG emission from every sectors. One of them is land use, and reducing deforestation and forest fire is going to be a huge win for Indonesia's commitment to the climate mitigation target. From land use perspective, there are three things that Indonesian government wants to achieve. The first one is intensification rather than extensification, and this has been materialized by the palm oil moratorium by Jokowi's government. And the second is reducing deforestation and increasing the reforestation efforts. This part could be seen if you looked at the policy of social forestry and agrarian reform. Protections of forest and the needs to increase reforestation is actually embedded and built into the social forestry program. The area that has been designated for social forestry, such as community forest, as well as village forest, there's a built-in safeguard that the community needs to restore the land up to 200 to 400 trees per hectares of restoration, as well as protecting the remaining forest. So this major land use policy is actually aimed to reduce emission from land use sectors. So I think that's kind of an overview of how LCDI can be like the high-level documents that sectoral initiative can refer to. We will see in the next couple of months, as well as the election in April, what the next administration would go for. But as long as we have an LCDI document, this could be seen as a reference to reduce the Indonesian greenhouse gas emission in the future.
Thanks, Andika. So conscious that we're nearing the end of the time, or we are at the end of time, we're going to answer two more questions quickly. But I do want to note that we have recorded this webinar and we'll send it around to everyone who joined today. So we'll get to two more questions and then we'll send around the recording, and if others have questions that were not answered, we can get back to you. Please feel free to email me. My email's on the slide deck here. So next question, I think someone said earlier in the webinar that there was a ban on using fires for land clearing. It does not apply to farms less than 2.6 hectares. I thought that recently that exemption for smallholders was withdrawn. Do we know which is true?
Okay, so there's actually a ban on using fires to clear lands, but the exception for smallholders is also conditional. So if it is a dry season,
I couldn't remember the exact parameters, but if there's a dry season with X numbers of days without rains, this exemption is going to be eliminated. So it's going to be a total ban, even for smallholders and even for indigenous communities. So this exemption is conditional to how the biophysical aspect of the land at that time. So that's the short explanation of that ban.
Thanks again, Andika. So the last question we'll get to, and then I do note that there are a few others here, and we can email you directly with answers to your questions. Last question. You said that land speculation was one of the roots of forest fires. Could you elaborate a little more on this, please?
Right. So a lot of land banking practices in Indonesia they're trying to make money out of these land banking practices. So, for example, the principal permit that they can get from a bupati, from head of a district, they can sell it for more money if the land has been cleared. And getting a principal permit and location permit from a district head is not something that is scrutinized by a high-level ministry such as the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. So it is perceived as easier route for those who wants to get money from this land banking and land speculation practices to just get an initial temporary license to develop land, and then they clear the land, and then they can sell it that land to another parties for a much higher money. And this is true for some of the area that we work with in Riau in South Sumatra. There's a research on the political economy of forest fire that kind of details out how these practices pans out in Indonesia. The research is by C4 scientist Heru Purnomo. Maybe later we can also send a link to those of you who are interested in this. But the practice is there, and clearing land with forest fires is the cheapest way to clear the lands, and then they can sell it for a much higher price than they bought it for.
Great. Thank you, Andika, Tai, and Hidayah. We'll wrap up the questions for now. I'm conscious that we're a couple minutes over time. As I mentioned, we have recorded this webinar, so we'll email that around to everyone who joined. We'll make sure to answer questions directly that we did not get to during this time live. We'll email you. And please feel free to email me. My email is here on the slide. If you have any questions, I can always connect you with our team. So thanks everyone for joining today.